Okay, well, we're back, and this is part three, and we're moving into a discussion of kinship. But before I do that, um, I did, I got thought, I screwed up. So when I was trying to define for you avunculocal resonance, I know what it is, but I always get it. I always like gets confused in my head when I try to make it come out of my mouth. So I said that avunculocal resonance is something that you find in some matrilineal societies, and that's definitely true. But then I said that it's when in a matrilineal society where husband and wife, man and woman get married and they go live with the family of her maternal uncle. I was wrong about that. They go in a avunculocal society. Okay, I'm going to make sure I read this so I don't mess it up. In an avunculocal society, a man and a woman get married and they go live with the maternal uncle of the husband. Okay, so they go to the household of the groom's mother's brother, his maternal uncle. All right, that's avunculocal resonance. Okay, and again, you find it in some matrilineal societies. Okay, so now moving on. We've said about all we're going to say about marriage, and I wanted to move now into kinship. Okay, so don't worry about writing down or copying down this here big diagram. Okay, this whole big thing here. Don't worry about that. Um, just there again to show you how anthropologists make a big deal about kinship. Now, you will learn toward the end here, you will learn about the Hawaiian system and where that came from, and you will learn about the Eskimo system and who talked about that, and you will learn about the Iroquois kinship system when we get into systems of naming relatives, but don't fret. I'm not going to make you draw these little diagrams or triangles or circles or anything like that. Okay? All right. So, what do we want to start with? Well, I think, we want to return to the idea that we began with at the top in part one. And that is that through kinship, many groups organize all kinds of tasks and activity. So that kinship is the organizing principle of indigenous or traditional or folk societies, whatever we want to call them. Kinship has become less of an organizing principle in our society, in an industrial or a post-industrial society, because we have specialized institutions that organize different kinds of activities. But among many indigenous people, a person, for example, lives with the same people, right? You live like basically your whole life with the same people. Most of them are your relatives. And they work with them, they socialize them, they worship with them, and so on. So kinship groups in a traditional or indigenous society are in that case multifunctional. Everything gets organized around kinship. All right. All right. So how can we define kinship? Well, I got the definition right down here. I'm going to get myself out of the way. Okay. And here's how. If you look straight down, okay, right down here. All right down here. There's the definition of kinship. That kinship is a system of determining who one's relatives are and what one's obligations are to them. And that a very important issue related to kinship is descent. Okay, descent. So descent is going to tell us not only about who your ancestors are, but descent's also going to tell us about descent is also going to tell us about things like wealth inheritance and so forth. Okay, All right. So what we're going to begin with here are different ways or different systems of descent. So we're going to have two, broadly speaking, two different systems of descent. We're going to have one that's going to be called unilineal, right? Unilineal descent, and another one called non-unilineal descent. Okay, so unilineal and non-unilineal. Unilineal, one line. Non-unilineal, not one line. Okay. All right. So where do we go from here? Kinship systems. How do they vary? Kinship systems vary from culture to culture. Okay. So kinship systems vary from culture to culture. How do they vary? Well, first of all, they're going to vary according to how people trace kinship ties. Do we trace those kinship ties down your mother's side of the family, down your father's side of the family? Okay, and so if we're tracing kinship down mother's side, or we're tracing kinship down father's side, that's a unilineal system. Or do we trace it down both sides? That's going to be a non-unilineal system. I don't know why I keep doing that. All right. What else? Normative expectations. Okay, normative expectations. Rules about how people are supposed to interact with each other. Kinship systems vary, right, according to rules about how people are supposed to relate to each other. So sometimes anthropologists use the word avoidance, or they use the word joking to describe different kinds of relationships within kinship systems. And, basically the difference between them, avoidance doesn't mean that you're hiding from somebody. But when anthropologists talk about avoidance relationships, they mean more like relationships where you're supposed to give somebody respect, right, and deference. Okay, that would be like an avoidance relationship. And joking relationships are kind of like what they sound like. Right? These are much more informal relationships that people would have to each other. So maybe, my relationship to my grandfather was more like an avoidance relationship, but my relationship to my cousins was more like a joking relationship. All right. And then how else do kinship systems vary? They vary according to how relatives get classified. So classification of relatives. Are people related biologically or not? Right. Um, in classifying relatives, how are biological facts used? Or whether we're related to somebody biologically or not, how are those facts used? And basically what that means is, what kind of meaning do people attach, right, to biological facts? Okay. And so there we'll be, a little bit later on, we're going to be talking about something called the cultural construction of kinship. And that's what we mean there is, how are facts of relationship used? What kind of meaning do they have? Okay. All right. Okay. So we're going to start with unilineal descent systems. We're going to talk about unilineal systems, and then we're going to talk about non-unilineal systems. So I want to get myself here out of the way. Move myself up here. Okay. So here's what we're going to start with, talking about unilineal and non-unilineal descent systems. First of all cultures are going to consider some kinds of relatives more important than others. Okay? Some cultures are going to consider, all cultures are going to consider some kinds of relatives more important than others. So, these systems have ways of reducing the number of relatives. Which relatives are your most important ones and which ones are not so important, right? Which ones do we emphasize and which ones don't we emphasize? If we were looking, I think, at our society, and I'm going to be repeating myself here, but if we're looking at our society, and our kinship system, we place the most importance on the relatives that are closest to us. Almost like throwing a rock in a pond. That's a metaphor I'm going to come back to several times, right? You know, there's like you in the middle, you and your mommy and daddy and your brother and your sisters, and those are the most important relatives. And you move out to your grandparents and your aunts and your uncles, and they're still important, but they're, you know, on that the next ring. And then as we move out, right, in those rings, so beyond your aunts and your uncles, now you got your first cousins, then you got your second cousins, right? And then you have these more distant cousins, and like these are the people that you go to a wedding or a funeral and you don't recognize. You know you're related to them, but you don't recognize them, you know. And you may never even talk to them or interact with them unless you're at some kind of big family event like that, okay? So we reduce the number of relatives in our kinship system according to the distance they are from us, right? How distantly related they are to us. Now, in a unilineal system, they reduce the number of relatives in a different way, right? They reduce the number of relatives by emphasizing one side of the family over the other, okay? So they're gonna, like I say here, they're gonna use the sex of a connecting relative to define who is close kin, okay? And if we're using one side of the family, that's going to be the mother side or the father side, okay? The mother side or the father side and the mother side. So if I'm maybe tipping my hand a little bit here, but if we live in a patrilineal society, that means that the relatives on our father's side are the more important relatives than the relatives on your mother's side, okay? And vice versa. If we lived in a matrilineal society, the relatives on our mother's side would be way more important than the relatives on our father's side. Everybody follow that? So, in a sense, if we're a patrilineal society, your father's, put it this way, if you're a patrilineal society, you are more related to the relatives on your father's side than you are to the relatives on your mother's side. Okay, everybody got that? Okay. So now we got patrilineal and matrilineal descent. All right, patrilineal and matrilineal descent. They're kind of like mirrors of each other. But didn't mean to do that. Or maybe I did. Yes, I did. Okay, patrilineal descent. Patrilineal descent is the most common form of unilineal system. Okay, patrilineal descent is the most common form of unilineal system. All right. However, there are many examples of matrilineal systems too. So patrilineal descent, most common form, but doesn't mean that there aren't matrilineal systems. There's enough of them to consider important. Okay. All right. And the concept that we're going to develop, I'm going to in the next part. All right. The concept we're going to develop in the next part is the concept of the descent group. Okay. The descent group. Now this is where the lingo starts to get a little complicated. All right. Unilineal systems have the most involved kind of lingo that we have to talk about. Bilateral systems, or I'm sorry, unilineal systems are much easier to explain. There's much less terminology, but unilineal descent has a few layers of terminology that we have to kind of get through. But if you just understand the basic concept, just keep it all in mind. So the way we're going to define a descent group is that these are people who recognize a common identity, right, and cooperate for many different purposes. So unilineal descent groups are related through only one sex. They're going to be related through either the man or the woman, right, through the father or the mother. And we're going to talk about 3 different types of unilineal descent group. There's going to be the extended family, right? The lineage, that's a word we've been using already, the lineage, and then something called the clan, all right? And that's all I'm going to give you in this part for now, to give you a little chance to digest that, okay? So I'll see you back here in a little while.